En effet, je vais parler de quelques-unes de mes traductions vers l'anglais. Donc, j'ai préparé mon petit truc en anglais. So I'll just read, basically, or talk about this in English first. I've been, just to introduce myself, I've been a translator of poetry for 16 years now, and a commercial translator for 20, having learned through, I apprenticed through informally, because there was no formal system to a certified translator, after working 20 years in the service and transportation industries, where I also worked with text. As well, I've been publishing poetry for the last 40 years. And so I guess I've published in all that time 17 books of poetry, 13 or 14 books of poetry in translation into English, from French, Galician, Gallego, or idioma del noroeste de España, if you understand me, and also from Spanish and Portuguese, and also even a bit of co-translation from Ukrainian, just for the fun of it. So I work primarily, I am the internet. I work primarily in Canada, but even more in the US and Spain, the UK, Chile, Argentina, Brazil. I studied, I didn't just, I read a lot of books about language and neurology, language and the brain on my own, and worked through an interest in communication theories, feminist theory, mind-brain theory. Well, I also took many courses in management, restaurant design, cooking, philosophy, I'm a cook, strategic planning. So I've had a pretty unusual educational path and a busy career. I've been privileged very much in finding audiences for my translations and for my own poetry. And because translation of international literary authors by Canadians is not, the publication of those, the translation and the publication of them is not fundable by our main funder of literary publications, the Canada Council, my career has rather forcibly blossomed in large measure outside the country in which I'm a citizen. If you're going to be a translator of international writers or an astronaut, you have to leave Canada. Unfortunately for you guys, I invented the internet, so you can still live here. I thought I'd just talk a little bit about some things I've learned by translating poetry, which is one of the most insane, non-remunerative things a person can do. But also, it's translating poetry, particularly challenging poetry, but there's a level in which all poetry is challenging, is one of the most rigorous and eye-opening ways to increase your language skills and improve your brain dexterity. And a key thing, I guess, about poetry for me is that, about translating, is that it involves a task that is kind of the opposite of the task in commercial translation, where your responsibility is to the reader of your eventual text. And as such, you attempt to translate unambiguously into a kind of idiomatic language that in the right register for the person who's going to be receiving the text. In poetry, we don't care about the reader. Your responsibility is largely to the language of the poem itself, and to what I call the soundscape of the poem, to its cadence, to its structure, to the echoes that it provokes, and to what the material letter conveys, and to what the text, that the material letter also conveys to the ear. There's a materiality of orality to the ear. There's a materiality to the eye. And both those things create echoes, and all of those things in a poem contribute to what the poem means. They both work together. Sounds in poetry always provoke and evoke other sounds, and that is what makes, one of the things that makes a poem, what we say, resonant. Why is this poem has resonance? It's more than just these words on the page, but something else is happening. Okay, that's responsibility. One of the main challenges then in translating poetry is what I've called in the past affective. And if you Google Erin Moure effective challenge translation, you'll probably find something about it. The relation between bodies and spacings and locales that deeply informs one word and gives it resonance, participates in its generation of meaning. How do you read that text as a foreigner? When I go to translate Chus Pato, I'm reading her as a foreigner, her Galician. I'm not reading her Galician the way Galicians read Galician. I've lived there a lot, so I can give a pretty good approximation and guess at a lot of things. But I can't really do it. And even then, I'm like, well, are you even reading this work that you're going to translate, this work at all, when you can't read it as a native speaker? What the heck are you reading? Sometimes you don't know. And then I go back, is the concept of native speaker even valid when the body of the entire 100% body of readers in a language is so various in their individual experiences of language? Even from one side of a city to another, accents and lexicons differ in the same language. I don't know if a Chuspado poem can be read in the east and the west of Lugo and get the same thing out of it. So that when I translate, all I can translate is my reading. I can't translate anything else. The text itself is just ink and paper, and it's silent, It's just silent. And so it is that I maintain reading that creates literature. Literature resides in what I call the third space, the space between the reader and the text. What emerges when I read, that's literature. This is a pile of paper. We're brought up, or we're acculturated to believe in representation, so we think this is literature. It's not. So that's, anyway, so that's the third space. Other things I've written about in terms of translating poetry besides affect and spacing, as I was saying, soundscape, play, the translator is chimera, the relation of translation to time, which in short is that translation makes time go backwards. And those essays, my essays and essayings in poetic form are in the library and on the internet. So I was going to talk, bring down that, after that brief introduction, to something that's key to the resonance of poetic language when you're translating, and that's ambiguity, and which I have been known to call, there's productive ambiguity and there's non-productive or distracting ambiguity. And whenever we translate, we encounter both of those things. As I say, in commercial translation, we try to remove ambiguities. In poetry, it functions using ambiguity. If you remove it, then you've just written your own poem, but you haven't translated the poem. So I think that in every bit of language, and we mostly try to erase this when it becomes visible and interferes with text, there's potential for ambiguity, and even more so in the movement between languages. And either in terms of the various possible meanings for the word, the amplitude of meanings of a word, which are never the same thing from one language to another, or in terms of the language's structures. And fortunately for us, I mean, cultural consensus that is largely unspoken makes us unaware of many of the structural issues in our own language. We all share them, and we don't notice them very much as causes of ambiguity or as problematic. And a quick example I can give about that is one that I talk about. This is my most recent translation of François Turcot. There's a little essay in the back about translation, hiding there. In French, the gendering, this is just quickly sketched for you. In French, the gendering of a noun, of a name, of a noun, a substantive, say, son livre, means that the book is a masculine noun, which has nothing to do with testosterone. In English, the gendering of a noun, if son livre, how am I going to translate that? I have to look for some other kind of clue, because in English, gendering of a noun refers to the physical sex of the person who owns the book. What does that have to do with the book, I ask you? And in a poem, sometimes reading in French, it's son livre. It doesn't actually matter always what the sex of the owner of the book is. Like, who cares already? I mean, so in order to translate it as his, her, their, or its book, I have to find it somehow in the poem, and sometimes it's not even there. Actually, in French, the gender of owners is a kind of ambiguity. There's something left open every time you say son livre. It's not noticed by people in French because it's habitual. To people in English, who are used to all possessed objects belonging to somebody who has a gender, then you feel like, ooh, ambiguity. Like, what's going on? Anyways, here's another, I was going to show you another example then of, go away from the waka, of in Chuspado, in her book that's coming out soon,
This is the English, which is a beautiful poem, so I'll just read it. Clarity of judgment. I understand that life is what we live. This, yours, mine, our life. I understand that a poem is poverty in comparison with life. I understand it's a pause, that for an instant it separates life from itself, that it weighs and balances, rends the senses. I understand it is access to the intellect, a corporeal vertex, improper. That's how I understand it. That the poem indicates the disconnect between melody and sense. I understand a poem can be written only with end lines. It upturns the language. It upturns life. So that's one reading of this poem, because structurally in Galician, I'll show you the Galician, you see there's no je or I or eu.
Is that like close to Spanish?
It's Spain's first colony, Galicia, in the year 800. It's the root language of modern Portuguese. It's to understand, if you go back and read, to understand why there are two main language groups, the main ones. There's other northern languages that don't fall in them, Spanish and Portuguese on the Iberian Peninsula. You have to go back to the pre-Roman Celtic inhabitation. But in Galician, you don't have to say, like, entendo que a vida é o que vivimos, esta tua, minha, nossa vida. Entendo que poema é pobreza medido por vida. Entendo que é pausa. Que por un instante separa a vida de si, que pesa e fai balance. Esguía os sentidos. Entendo que é acceso ao intelecto, un vértice corpóreo e propio, así o entendo. Que o poema indica a desconexión entre melodía e sentido. Entendo que un poema só se escribe con versos finais. Desfonde o idioma, desfonde a vida. Anyways, here you'll just notice up here that there's no, the verb ending tells you what person is speaking. So entendo means I'm speaking. So you don't have to say I in Galician. You only say it if you're trying to get a word in edgewise, you know, eu entendo. Otherwise you just say entendo. So we have that thing. But the other thing is that these are all subordinate clauses. Esguía os sentidos. Here I can tell. The other thing is that the normal structure of Galician is that the subject, when it's named, goes after the verb. So if this said esguían los sentidos, it would mean the senses render or tear. But because this is singular and this is plural, I know this is an object. There we go. Okay. So, but the problem is when we come down to this thing at the bottom. Can you guys see desfondo idioma, desfonde a vida? Because here they're both singular. And I have here, like, entendo, I understand that a poem can only be written with end lines or with final verso is both verse, but it's also one poem line is a verse. Con versos finais. But, so I can say desfond, the last thing that was singular is a poema. So it could be the poem busts open the language, busts open life, which, ouais, défense. But it's more like desfond is fondar. It's like plows up for the first time. It's like, it could be like punches the bottom out of something, but it's also plows it up. Like plowing a furrow, you desfonder a terra. And, or it could be that the idiom busts out. The language busts out, life busts out. Or the poem busts life. So that there's this productive ambiguity in Galician that makes the poem resonate very strongly at the end that I can't do exactly in English. Anyways, I like that poem because it's fun that it does that. So, if I could get a light, I can't read. So that was just a little Pado example there. I've got going to, I want to go now to Andres Sahens, who's a Chilean poet. He speaks and writes in Spanish, Portuguese, Portuguese, Gallego, Francais, and he also speaks some Aymara and Quechua, which are also indigenous languages that have had an influence on Chilean Spanish. Like the most South American Spanish and Brasileiro has influences both from on the Brazilian side, from Africa, from Yoruba, and the other places have influences from many of the indigenous languages. In our case, with English and French, we largely lack interpenetration from the indigenous languages that surround us, except from the era of contact to the end of the buffalo. There was interpenetration there. At the end of the buffalo, people signed treaties which were not respected by the government, and people were put in residential schools. The residential schools stopped people from speaking their native language, genocidal crime. However, they also impoverished English and French by not allowing that interpenetrative effect of languages to occur. And anyway, so that it's a bit crazy trying to translate poetry from South America at times, unless it's just like people who are totally, you know, brancos, people who are totally in the Caucasian kind of community. But Andrés has this idea of the untranslatable as the poem itself, like poem and untranslatable mean the same thing. And he talks about that the energy that, it's an energy that's cited, the poem, but it can move or be moved. It can be venerated or destroyed. And he brings into the picture in talking about the poem in this book, Poetry After the Invention of America, the Aymara or Quechua word, waka. A waka is that kind of thing. It could be like an idol, but it's something that can be, it's cited, but it can also be moved. It can be destroyed or venerated. And the huacas of a people are the things of cultural value to it. So a waka can also have no material aspect, but it's those things that are of cultural value. And the waka in those languages has entered Chilean Spanish as waka. And it's also in Bolivian Spanish and in many other of the Spanishes. So I was going to show you both, so to the poem in general and the translation, this whole idea of destruction, veneration, the idea of the waka, like Andrés always says, maybe the waka is the poem, or at stake in the poem anyways. So I'm going to show you quickly a poem of Andrés. If you understand Spanish, you'll know this is impossible. It's actually not in Spanish, it's in Portuguese, this one. It's partly in Portuguese. Anyways, Tarsila do Amaral was a Brazilian painter, a woman in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and so on. And she also only wrote about 4 poems. So inédito means unpublished, but it also means unexpected or unprecedented, you know. And Jamel Churata was a indigenous Spanish writer in the middle of the 20th century as well, who wrote a book. What was the name of his damn book? The Golden Fish, considered by many to be the Bible of indigenism. That was published in 1957. He was a Peruvian avant-garde poet. So there's these 2 references here, and then it's like Lili, Dishimiau, Waka Peixe do Pirai, que foi, que viu, que vi. Waka nunca apenas waka, porém mesmo de flor, mesmo barraca, mesmo de terça margem de pirai, vi, ar, mar, verdade, outro peixe d'ouro, outro assim, respirai. So that's Portuguese. And trying to translate a poem like that is a crazy kind of a thing. So I thought I would do it for you, and I showed it to Andrés. So this was my first version, because li is I read in Spanish, but it's not. But if I put I read, we have this infelicitous ambiguity in English that R-E-A-D can be read, or read. Wow. So I changed it to the anterior past. I had read, so that to oblige the reading of read instead of read. So I dread, tell me how waka fish of the pirai. What's it? What did it read? What had it read? What did I read? Waka never is just waka, though even in dread, even in waka, even on the 3rd bank of the Rive Pare, I dread mar, verdade, further golden fish, furthermore, brise, order. So I tried in this poem, I kept some words like this waka here, whatever, and I ended up having to create a whole series of notes, like in Tupi, Pirai is a river of fish. It's a river in Brazil, the Pirai also. And then of course in Quechua, waka is a spirit totem or an idol that animates things or places. Waka is the same thing. A terça margem de Pirai is an echo of a short story by João Guimarães Rosa, who shape and sound changed Brazilian Portuguese and brought certain aspects of orality of Brazilian Portuguese into written form. His work's very hard to read unless you read it out loud, and you know how Portuguese sounds. Anyway, this short story is about a river as life story, and it has a kind of intertext with the biblical story of Noah, and thus it's a cosmological poem. I just left this, Armar Verdade, because I didn't know what to do with it, but that's air, sea, truth. But truth is spelled with a V, not a B, but in Spanish and in Galician, not really in Portuguese. Verdade, well, verdade is verdade, but it's there's no V sound, so they're both V. This is his golden fish, and then breeze, or there, breeze, respira aí. Aí is, there's two theirs in Portuguese and Galician. There's a close there and a farther there. So aí is, and maybe aí is more like here, but aqui is here, acá is here. There's a lot of here's, so it's like not like here. It's a little further than here, but it's not over there. And I ended up putting or there because I thought that makes the sound of order, it reads order, and I kind of liked the idea that dread came into this, because if we were venerating or destroying something, the kind of aspect of dread seemed kind of interesting. Anyways, Andres told me this isn't only a river in Brazil, Erin, it's a river in Santa Cruz de la Sierra in Bolivia too. And I'm like, oh, his partner who died of a heart attack in Santa Cruz de la Sierra, Bolivia last year and came from there. So it's a reference somehow to Emma Villazon, who's a really well-known Brazilian writer. And he also told me Humahuaca, which this was Humahuaca and I put in Huaca. He said it's actually a well-known place in the north of Argentina. I don't know if it's Quechua, it means the Huaca Principal, or Aymara, it means the Huaca of the water. And he says, I'm also playing with the Portuguese Humahuaca, Huaca. And I was like, okay, thanks for that. Then this meaning air, sea, truth, he also reminded me that these like Erin, there's a liar, like to link here. Margem do liar, link, sea, truth. So he's linking sea and truth. The rat. So I ended up, what else did he tell me? I'm glad he's alive, you know, because I'm translating these things. Yeah, so he talks about poetry, the Waka's poetry. He talks about this Lili. Is Lili somebody named Lili? Is it, what kind of a song is it? Is it just the title of the poem? Is it Lili here? Is it really, because it has to be something else besides I read, because it's in Spanish and not in Portuguese, and the poem's in Portuguese. Anyways, so that was my first translation, then I revised it after hearing him. I kind of put unpublished by Taxila do Amaral, unprecedented, unique, notorious, and unexpected. I dread, tell me, waka fish of the Pirai, what's it? What did it read? This is easier to read this as read instead of read now. What did it read? What did I read? Waka never is just waka, though, and it's kind of interesting that the word just is split, because just is justice too, and it makes you look longer at that word. Plus it turns it into a kind of a V.P. Nichols Saint Waka. Waka never is just waka, though, even in dread, even in Umuhuaca, even on the third bank of the Pirai, I dread a dark truth, further golden fish, furthermore breathes there. So I managed a liaison here. I dread a dark truth, because he's misspelled truth as verdade, I misspelled it as truth, which looks like a trout, like a fish. Further golden fish, furthermore, breathes dare, like breathes dare, but also breathes like poetry is a dare. So that's some of the things that's at stake in writing poetry, and that's all I really have to say. Sorry.
Bonjour. le plaisir de traduire. En fait, c'est le dernier livre que j'ai traduit, c'est Petit théâtre.
Ah oui, mais
Oui.
c'est dans le fond, c'est...
Oui, ça fait quelques temps, mais j'ai traduit d'autres choses. Il n'y avait pas de livre au complet.
Ah, ok.
Puis, moi, j'aimerais ramener ça peut-être à l'expérience de la traduction pour disons, répondre en écho à ce que Erin a présenté. I actually was born in the West Island in Montreal, which means that, and I was in a zone in the city of Lachine, which is named for China, which is already a translation in a way. A translation mistake, actually, because as you might know, Cavalier de la Salle traveled to discover a passage to China and came back to his lands on the West Island, and then the inhabitants called it La Chine to make fun of him. But he still discovered the mouth of the Mississippi River, which is not that. And basically, in this reality where I was growing up, English was the first otherness in a sense. Like, I'd go to French school and there would always be like 3 or 4 kids that were English and their parents had decided to put them through French school. So, Yuri, Ishel, I remember then Karen, and they were all like native English speakers, enormist. And I actually learned English only when I was about in the 4th grade, I guess, and we had a Polish teacher. The teacher was Miss Poparich, who used to wear these strange polka dot skirts and funky hats, and she had a very strong Polish accent, and this was my first contact with the language, so I got her reading, as Erin was underlining, I got her reading of English in a sense, and later on in life I would meet a lot of Polish people that I would work with, and I would always come back to this idea of this first encounter with the language through this live Polish translation in a sense, or this person inhabited by English as this language of adoption. And when I started my career as a writer, actually, I came here during referendum year, so in 1995 I was tired of University of Quebec. I wanted to see another reality. I jumped on the metro and took a Herman Melville course here, which was very fraught with like tension and friendliness at the same time. I was the only French guy in the seminar. Referendum is going on, so of course the conversation. And then I have to write in English for the first time in my life. And I didn't notice before that I did not write in English in any non-official, obligatory kind of context. So I had to write my first essays in English, and I was praised for my writing style and all that, so that was nice. And the year after, I moved to Vancouver to do a Master of Publishing, and I don't pronounce my H's, you'll notice, but I got hired by off the school benches to write in English. And so when I published my first book back then, in French in Quebec, and then I started earning my living writing in English, which seemed highly unorthodox, let's say. Especially since I came from a publishing program where what I wanted, there was only one in Canada at the time, which was at Simon Fraser University. And the thing I was good at was the substantive editing, so the deep work on let's say the precision work on the manuscripts and all that. But they wouldn't have me in English publishing houses because I was a French speaker, and there's this sort of unwritten rule. That's what I felt anyhow. Maybe I misread the situation. Then I got hired to do this new media work with a bunch of Polish people. And then I learned a lot about shaping book objects, the thing that is not literature, but that can talk to literature. And in a sense, all these steps in a certain way, like, created a context for me to desire to do translation. So, to enact translation in a way. The other thing I discovered at the time was that my family name is Canty, but which I actually mispronounced by putting an S between the T and the Y. That's what we do in Quebec. We just don't write it down, Canty. And yes, but it's actually an Irish name. So in a way, my translation, my mathematical or vectorial translation from the reality, the bilingual reality of the West Island in Montreal to Vancouver allowed me to discover, in a sense, my inner Irishman, and which gives you the right to translate in both languages, and also to drink and engage in arguments and highfalutin literary activities. So, in a sense, this experience also of living in what I call Anglophonie, Anglophonia, to generalize the sort of English continent surrounding some of these pockets of French. That's what triggered the desire to bring back books that I had experienced in this, let's call it, exile. So after there were a lot of readings when I was away there, which touched me and which allowed me to question my relationship to this new language in which I was making my life at the time. And when I came back to Quebec, and I decided that I would bring them back into my culture in a sense. And so every project started with the desire to bring like this closeness that I had felt to these books, to bring it into the reality of Quebec. And the first project I proposed was White Stone by Stephanie Bolster, which maybe some of you have had her as a teacher because she teaches here in the English and creative writing departments. And she'd written this kind of autobiography of coming of age as a woman and all that through the figure of Alice in Wonderland. And I think I decided to translate it because I saw her talking to her parents on my street corner. Mm-hmm. And then I decided that this project was possible to propose in a sense because of this reality or this image that I met in reality. And when I came back to Montreal, I simply proposed to Éditions Norrois, which is one of the oldest French publishers of poetry, to allow me to not only translate the book, but to shape it into a book object that would testify to this reading experience. So to remake the book within the cultural context, within the cultural context of Quebec, and to translate not only what it contains, but also its form in a sense. And this I call in French mise en livre. And on every book I've translated, not everyone actually, but all the books I've translated and published at Le Norrois, including Erin's Little Theaters, I've also constructed the book object so that it would narrate in a certain sense its own translation. And what I want to underline with this in a sense is that every one of these books reflects there's two kinds in a sense of literary translations. One, I did these books, and then I did the Charles Simish, Time Star Alchemy, Michael Ondaatje's Man with Seven Toes. Then I did Erin's Little Theaters. But in between that, the reception of these books, or I guess the way they were perceived, made other people call me to do translation projects. And strange things happened because of the sensibility to the plastic or the material dimension of the book, all that. I got a phone call a couple of years ago from a gallerist in Chicago who is now deceased, and he said, "We heard about you, and there's an artist in Boston that would like you to translate an astronomical treatise written by an anarchist in prison in the 19th century in order to make a limited edition and present it within an exhibition in a context where it becomes unreadable because it purely became a book object." And so I spent a year translating in English a treatise that the artist couldn't even read, actually, which was interesting. So it built from an intuition, because the book was mentioned by Walter Benjamin, Friedrich Nietzsche, and other staple references of the art world. He was interested in the image of this book in a sense, and he wanted to activate this image within the exhibition context. So this was printed in 50 copies. There is no other existing English translation. They tried to commercialize it after, but when I got to Boston and I got to the exhibition, the book was under glass. And so it was kind of radiating this aura of having been translated. And in a way it remains, there's one copy at Artex and there's this copy in Montreal, and that's it. And this kind of gesture, this translation was more complicated than a lot of the other ones. One, because Auguste Blanqui does not write very well, but it is very interesting too, because he describes, he also wrote a treatise on how to take up arms against the rulers in Paris and make barricades, kind of handbook. So he spent a lot of time in jail, and what he liked to think about when he was in jail was the stars and how they were formed, and how somehow the whole landscape of the sky, which he only saw through this tiny window, was a huge battle of time. And every time he describes an astronomical phenomenon, it's like a cannonball hitting each other, and every metaphor is military, and everything's kind of overblown and overwritten. And he's always like asserting facts, like this is how it works, and it was proven like not very long after that this is not the case. But the fact is, though, that it's a metaphorical understanding of the world, and in a sense, it's a book that tries to understand the world through imposing images on it. And to me, it was the scenario of translating this, and I would have liked the book to be commercialized, but apparently they couldn't deal it after. They didn't cut a deal. They tried with Melville House and other places. So this idea that this gesture, this gesture was enacted, and that this book becomes a sort of background radiation of an act of translation. And I think in a way it arcs back to what Erin was saying about the reading being the translation. And in this case, it's certainly, that's what it is. It's a reading that was made into a very expensive limited edition thing, and we'll see how in the chain of being it can duplicate or create another reality in a sense. But what I have to say also about this particular experience is there was the dialogue with the artist also was very fraught because of this very identity of the French entity translating who doesn't pronounce H's, and we had no idea. We worked together for a year, so there's a sort of a seed of mistrust there, which is interesting too, because everything becomes a kind of dialectic and a dialogue or a transaction in a sense. And so in the end, the book just bears the mention, edited and with an afterword by Josiah McElhelney, and the name of the translator is inside. Whereas the book is mostly an act of translation. Why am I underlining that? Because there's a whole question also in a way of ownership, I guess, behind these gestures. And when you're working also in Canada, if you want to do a translation project, as Erin mentioned also, somehow the publisher is the broker. And so so you have always another intermediary, which is the publisher. And even if I go, why I went to the Norrois, because I was publishing books with other publishing houses. I went there because I knew they would welcome a project where you could actually construct the whole book as if it was your own and edit it within the context of this publishing house. There's an openness in the dialogue in this sense. And to me it was important also because it's in a way it's a reading of the context in which you're acting. So why translate English books in Quebec? Lots of English people don't speak French, but most French people speak English in Quebec. And so what happens to translations that are from the English in Quebec in general is that they circulate in a very, let's say, limited and discreet way. And they have a hard time selling them simply because there's also, in the reading public, there's this notion almost that you should go to the original. And so it's another aspect of the dissonance, let's say, between these cultural contexts. And certain cases where the book is historical, for example, like poems translated from the Yiddish or something like that, then these things will usually circulate a little bit more. But it's a hard sell, let's say. But it's not hard to get into the context where you can do it. But what's difficult is to make it exist culturally. So, in a way, they become long-tail projects. Once they exist in libraries, they exist as moments of sometimes stunted dialogue. But what I think it creates, though, that is very true, and which was certainly the case with little theaters, there's a camaraderie, or there's a mixophone community that gets created. So it's people, in a way, that care about each other's writing, that start wanting to read it in a way that is so slow and involved that it becomes a part of their own writing. And that's always how I saw the act of... I can make money translating like fish soup recipes or something, which I don't do. But but the involvement in translating a book of poetry, it's a form of slow reading for me. It's a very simple formula, but it's what writing do I want to become a root or rhizome? We're at the university, you know, of my own writing. How do I want it to interweave, and what do I want to learn from it? And in a way, the whole story that I'm telling you about growing up in the West Island, moving to Vancouver, writing in English for the first time, writing in English for money, writing in English as part of a literary career, translating both ways, coming back and moving in both directions. It's a story in a sense of these personal relationships to people and objects and writing, and to be able somehow for it to seep into your own being. So it's how do they call it, like lifelong learning in a sense. And every time you decide to involve yourself with a book of poetry, it's like it's not the same as I would say as writing your own book, but it's the same as it's a reading that brings you back like to sort of almost the wonder that you might have felt at reading the first time you discovered its power, because you're reenacting in a way the creation or genesis of the book and asking all the questions again. Of course, there are two categories also of translation relationships, I'd say. One is with living authors that you can go down to their place, have a meal, and talk, you know, and there are those also who know the original language. I have a good anecdote to tell about Charlie Simish. And there are the dead ones that you have to deal with the trace or the afterglow of their writing. And then the dialogue, for example, with the Blanqui book was more with Josiah, and what he thought with his idea of the ghost of the original text, and the way you would interpret what I did with the text he didn't know. And so this created very interesting, like sort of echo chamber or sort of loops of dialogue. With Erin, of course, it was a very close, very close reading in a sense. And with Stephanie Bolster, same thing. I would visit her and have ice cream in Point Claire, and then we got to you know, into these detail work. She was there all along. But with Charles Simish, I think he pulled a trick on me, which was very nice actually. Basically, when I tried to get actually I tried something before coming here. I did a little performance. I want to translate Anne Carson, like Plain Water, her first book, which for me is the richest in terms of opening up the world of her work. And so I just wrote her and tried to get the rights, but she's a big cheese, so now I'm talking with the agent, and the agent said, I won't talk to the translator directly, so now it's all in the hands of the publisher, but it's going well. So my challenge... So my challenge was to get this going before I got here, and I wanted to have some kind of story to tell. And she actually answered something, you know, that was juicy or something. But with Charles Simish, it was so easy. I found his email, I don't remember how, and I just wrote him, and within the day, he wrote me, and I said, you know, I really like this book. Then I write these letters, and I argue for my reading of it, and how much I cared for it, and all that. pretty short stuff, don't want to bore them with their own glory also. So you're just trying to be a, nice chap, and to show your respect to the people who have made these books that you like, and you don't know them, you don't know how they're going to react. And he just wrote me a little email on his BlackBerry, because it said send from my BlackBerry, and says, I would like that very much, Charlie. And so that was it for the National Book Award winner. And then at the end of the whole process, there's an interesting actually thing that if you look, there are two. Has anybody read the Dime Store Alchemy in English? So there are two editions of the book, and as I'm combing through them and looking at, I noticed that two of there's a series of postcards he's written in there, and they're not the same in the two editions, the two English editions. And I noticed he cut one out, and then he wrote two more for the new edition. So the two printings of the book are actually not the same. So since I was on his good side, so I said, why don't you write some new stuff for the French version? So he actually wrote 5 new poems, which then we picked them together, and which ones do you like best in the sequence? Then I built another sequence from them of postcards, sent it back to him, and he's like, okay, I like that. So there's actually a part here of the book which has grown into the other language, which doesn't exist in the original. And I thought that was fun and very good mannered of him. And in the end, when I finished the work, he never told me, but he speaks French. So he got so he told me, I said, so how do you like the book? Do you like the way it looks? He says, yes, he says, I read the poems before going to bed. They please me immensely. And so I understood that he was actually a fluent French speaker. But which changed the work also, as I didn't know this. We're not in the same city. I didn't visit him and all that. So because it changes a lot if the person that you're translating can actually read the end language. A translated book for a publisher, it's it's often, translations also don't often sell in translations of Canadian novels into English. If the novel's not already very publicized, they have a hard time creating an event with a book that's not already an event. And in a way, these become a monnaie d'échange. So they become a way to trade and move the book into other languages. Because if you get it in English, then you can show it to almost everyone. And then maybe it will get translated into Hungarian or German. So often the English image of the book is the image that circulates as the exchange, as the medium of a transaction for selling translation rights. So these are the two reasons also why projects get picked up by publishers, because the French publishers will argue to get these things going and resonate through the system, so it's always better to sell the translation rights, at least for Canada. And just to explain this mise en livre business, and Erin will be able maybe to tell you about it, but for example, with Whitestone, I'm like, okay, this book, I'm reading this book, and it's a reading of Alice in Wonderland. So what's the first thing you think about when you think about Alice in Wonderland? Is that all the editions are illustrated. So I worked with Estela Lopez Solis to create a series of drawings that would be an answer, in a way, to this tradition of illustrated Alices, but now there would be illustrations of Stephanie Bolster's illustrations of the relationship between Lewis Carroll, Charles Dodgson, Alice in Wonderland, Alice Liddell, Stephanie Bolster. So all these chains of reflections, in a way. And so the illustrations in the end kind of build on these, through these black and white things, on these figures, you can look at it after, or just I'm not ending the $400. Just in case you had chips or something. And in the case of the Charles Simish book, it's a book about the art of Joseph Cornell, who is an artist that didn't know how to draw, paint, or sculpt, and that basically all he did is to, you might know his work, and is to find objects, put them together in boxes. And these boxes are these beautiful shadow boxes that sort of, and then give them names. Mostly it's untitled with a name that becomes very resonant. And in a way, Simish tried to translate and writing this book, which is a mix of prose, of verse, of images, and there are images in the original editions as well. He tried to translate the method of Joseph Cornell and to apply it to poetry. And in a way, I thought this book deserves also, its form deserves to be translated. And Joseph Cornell was a lonely walker through New York City, picking up these objects, putting them together. And to me, this book had to be a book that you could slip in your pocket and kind of walk around with and read it on Bryant Park or wherever you were in New York and get a little fix of your Cornell Simish experience. And so it becomes this sort of a breviary and it's anyhow. And so that was the second project. The third project was The Man with Seven Toes. Michael Ondaatje, man of very few words. And I dealt with him at the beginning, and then we had to go to the agent. And this is one of his lesser-known books from the 60s. Maybe you've read it. He's such an idol of English Canada. The Man with Seven Toes. It's a play and verse. So all these books, what they have in common also is that they invent their own genre in a certain sense. There are constructions that are in between poetry and some other thing. So, and they're and that's what I like also, this notion that this book sits on the edge between different genres, different realities. And to translate this is a Western that's set in Australia, but it's written in verse. It was only enacted as a play once. In the 1960s, there are no traces of this, as far as I know. And so the idea of this case, I invited artist Sophie Jaudoin to create a series of images also for this. And I created a sort of a partition, that allows you like to distribute the voices throughout the book. And to kind of stage a reading yourself if you were so willing, with action figures, for example. And the book's a Western, so that's why it looks like that. Some kind of I tried to ask to stage it after, but that's where it ended. So, and every case with these books, they're also accompanied by an essay that explains my reading and my choices for constructing this book. And always at the end, and it kind of becomes it spells out that desire I was telling you about for building these objects. And the last one I did was when I actually the first time I met Erin was at Blue Metropolis, and she seemed very tall, at least 8 feet tall. And, she was reading a poem about a dog made of water, and a dog of water, that is, not necessarily made of water, but a dog of water. And I was very impressed by her presence and the way the poetry rang through, and the way it created a sort of ripple through the room, and it seemed like the room was kind of filling with this liquid light. And you have to understand this is in one of these alienating downtown hotels, and somehow poetry created this parallel reality. And I don't remember how we got to know each other after that, but we became friends. And the years later, I decided this was the next step in terms of also in terms of authors, that Erin has been living in Montreal for like decades, and you've been translated rarely. And so I thought that it was about time to kind of spell out this presence in the city. And this work that I do with the books, also this one was done with Baptiste Alchoan, and I remember one day we were arguing about the way we'd put the page numbers on the page.
Where the page number was going to go.
Yeah, she was there, and she thought we were going a bit overboard.
I was like, just put them there, but it's like, no, we have to, I can't remember what it was. But it was also, then it went through email for days. They sent, like, people sending me samples and counter samples to get me on their side to struggle for the page numbers this way or that way. It was exciting.
Yeah, now also this is where I think we this is called the Soirée Mixophone evening. And I think
Et
it's...
c'était toi ton mot, mixophone.
Oui, at a dinner party.
Non,
Ouais,
mais
non,
avant
moi,
ça, mais c'est
J'ai dit
ça.
ça à un moment donné, mais je m'en rappelle.
Mais ça fait longtemps, ça fait des années.
Oui.
Les mixophones.
But then there's this group of writers now in Montreal that I think it started actually with these collective projects I did at Le Cartanier.
That's what brought us together.
Yeah, because I started inviting, since I'm back from Anglophonie, and I'm like, I made these collective books about the city, food, and sleep. And the second one was called La Table des Matières, and that's where I invited you. And La Table des Matières is a book about food
J'ai
that...
quelque chose dans le livre de...
Yes, you do.
Oh, yeah, sur
Because she would have had something in every book after. But because I wanted her to be there. But, and there were these English writers I was interested in Montreal. I'm like, how do you build a book that seems like it has no author, but has many authors? A book like that would read and write itself, but with us.
Oui, absolument.
And when we made this book about food, I decided to invite writers to a dinner, like a virtual dinner, which was not virtual, I hate that word, but like a dinner on paper, in a sense. So I wrote a personal letter, a fait part, so an invitation to dinner, to all the writers, and where I spelled out my personal readings of what there was to eat in their texts. And so I invited them to dine together within this book that would end up looking a little bit like a ham sandwich. But because it's brown with beige paper, which is the white bread, and then a pink middle. And it's called the table of contents because it's about food. And it's full of table of contents and illustrations and a digestive process. But it's not here, it's kind of hard to explain, but it's a book that eats itself. There's also a table of ingredients, everything you can eat in the book. So we're very thorough about classifying the information and food provided by the writers. And at that point, when we launched this book on sleep that's circulating, which changes color, we also launched expeditions of Chimera at the same time. And so more and more with the years, we became this mixophone like kind of group of writers through these collective projects where French poets, this is how...
Mais c'est comme ça. Moi, j'ai travaillé avec Juana Vasilikovic pour faire ce livre. Puis Juana est une traductrice de au moins 2 livres de Daniel.
Ouais.
Et
And I translated one.
François Turcot est un ami. Puis oui.
So it's like if you were to make a graph of this, it's all people translating each other, reading with each other, and it was a really it's not a first, but it was when we launched Livre de Chevet, the book on sleep. There's 24 authors. Book Tug launched 2 books at the same time, and Jay wouldn't talk to anyone, but that night was shy or something. But it's very rare that you get this in Montreal, like an event where you get French books and then you get English books launched the same night with both publics like mixing together. And that to me, these little gestures, they create spaces also where new encounters happen. And I think François, you met through this process, and then years later...
Moi, j'ai rencontré François à travers d'une artiste plastique, Vida Simon.
Ah, Vida,
ouais. C'était une amie de... Mais on est devenus amis lors des processus, des franco-mixophones.
The mixophone process.
The mixophone process. Mais aussi, là, c'est que une partie de mixophonie, c'est que Juana parle roumain, moi je parle galicien. J'ai un ami qui est comme Erin, qui est like a curator, conservatrice des expositions itinérantes au Musée d'art contemporain, qui parle espagnol, anglais, elle entend le portugais, le galicien. Puis parfois, quand on a de ces soupers mixophones chez moi, c'est comme tout le monde est en train de parler en comme au moins 6 langues. Puis on lit et puis on saute, on a des livres, on parle. Puis pour moi, c'est très riche cette vie-là. Et il y a dans ça aussi une ouverture envers le monde. Et c'est pas juste comme les francophones qui veulent avoir leurs livres traduits pour aller en France ou en Italie pour la promotion de leur œuvre. Pour nous, c'est toute une culture. Ouais, we still want that. Mais c'est pas juste ça, c'est que on parle de poésie. C'est un reflet du fait que, pour moi, la poésie, c'est une grande conversation et chacune fait, ou un grand textile, et chacune tisse un petit coin de ce grand textile. Et moi, quand je tisse mon coin, là, je tire un peu sur le textile, puis Daniel ressent comme lui est en train de faire ce qu'il fait. Puis c'est ça, ça élargit le monde pour moi, là.
Ben oui, puis aussi je pense que ce qui est intéressant avec, par exemple, un livre comme Little Theaters, you've read it, some of you have read it, and Little Theaters, there's a text in Galician, which I don't speak, but often and then they would have their counterparts in English, and then I would translate them in French, but often the Galician became more of a guide for me than the English, in some cases, because the sounds of Galician are much closer to the Latin of the Latin, la langue romane, the Latin part of French. So I could create a music that was closer to the Galician by kind of jumping over the English and listening to it while the Galician resonated through it.
Et ça, c'était très nécessaire aussi, car les traductions, le livre en anglais, les poèmes, il y a comme 2 séries de poèmes que j'ai écrits d'abord en galicien, puis moi j'ai traduit mes poèmes en anglais pour le lecteur anglophone. Mais ces traductions ne sont pas toujours exactes. C'est moi qui les ai fait, donc j'ai fait ce que je voulais. Mais pour Daniel, dans un livre dans lequel la version originale en galicien apparaît, et la traduction en français, ça ne faisait pas de bon sens de traduire ma version anglaise. D'avoir des traductions qui viennent de nos poèmes, en effet.
You kind of have to mix them both together and then listen to them. And then,
Oui.
when Erin was talking about the sound of poetry, I guess, the soundscape, la matérialité du texte.
Et pour l'oreille aussi.
So that's where it's like instruments mixing together and trying to get the right music in the end. And this is one thing also I must say in the way that I've now spoken a lot about the book itself, the books themselves and what they tell and the genres they invent, so these kind of general shapes or forms. But it's also when I translate, I try to keep the meter, even when it's irregular, as close as possible to the original rhythm. Including, for example, when Erin was talking about l'élision du sujet in Galician or in the ellipsis of the subject, you can do that in French, although it's often not well viewed. But in order to create a field of rhythm and stuff, it's often better to do that and to try to construct your verse in a way that's as sonorous as possible first, and then kind of recreate the force field of meanings through that. But to be true to the language and the materiality of the language, and even the way the lines sit on the page, because even when you pick the size of the book, there's a fidelity to it in a certain sense that you have to. For example, in Whitestone, I remember, because since it was the first one I did, I was like, I was driving the graphic designer crazy. The day before going to press, I was still calling her, and sometimes I would do everything in my power so that nothing would be on 2 lines if it was on 1 line in English. And just to get this thing to be just the right kind of volume occupying the surface. And that to me is part of the work of rewriting and reconstructing like what you've done at first. And even in terms of decoding the book, and every book is a different, it creates a different process because there's a different idiolect there. But and you're not just translating like sense, not sense events, meaning events. You're also translating like you're trying to recreate a music or a rhythm. That's pretty obvious, but it's the way to achieve it, and often when translating in French in Quebec, we do not have the same lexicon as the international French. And often the translations will be received in a kind of a strange manner especially with poetry. They'll accuse, in one case, for example, I was told that there were And on that sheet, I got one paper. Everything was positive, so this one French person that was like, oh, there, and then there are sentences like that. And it was one of the most mimetic lines and the translation. And so there's a perception also of the du geste qui a été posé, of the gesture and the way it was handled. And often I find that French translations, there's always these ideas that it expands the text. It does not need to do that. You just need to bring it back maybe to what you know from hearing English also within these contexts, and not try to normalize it through some kind of and I'm not talking about writing joies or anything, but not try to normalize it to this French international standard. It's got to the point, which I find strange actually, in a kind of dissonance, that I almost cannot read French translations because I do them, and then when I get to the often poetry, for poetry mostly, and I get to the French version from France, I get annoyed within 3 pages almost. Except in some cases, but...
La même chose est arrivée comme avec Choose Part, qui traduit du galicien. Elle avait comme 3-4 poèmes, je sais pas, 6 poèmes traduits en français international pour aller à Toulouse à un colloque. Quelqu'un a traduit ces poèmes. Puis quand elle était ici, puis on faisait comme une soirée mixophone au port de tête. Choose me donnait ses poèmes, car moi je lui ai dit, mais on est à Montréal, je ne peux pas juste lire mes traductions vers l'anglais, là, il faut que je fasse des traductions vers le français, que moi je ne suis pas douée en ça, mais c'est important. Puis elle me disait, oh mais j'ai ces poèmes-là qui ont été traduits, mais je suis gênée, je ne veux pas te montrer ça, car c'est terrible ce qu'ils ont fait avec, car elle lit le français. Puis je l'ai vu, et j'avais l'idée, car sa poésie est complexe, que le traducteur, la traductrice de la version française pensait que, mais en traduisant un poème en français, on améliore le poème. Just translating it into French is a way of improving it.
Now comes from Paris.
Oui, je sais pas pourquoi, mais en fait, j'ai retravaillé les traductions pour faire d'autres versions des poèmes que Choose me disait, mais c'est ça la traduction du galicien. L'autre, c'était comme, je sais pas, c'était comme une imposition du français sur le texte, c'était pas une traduction.
Erin, you want to tell us a little bit about that book?
This book?
Yeah.
This book is, I translated now 5 poems, Choose Pato's anthology.
Choose Pato Verlo.
Choose Pato's one of the most important writers, Galician writers or poets who's changed poetry in Galician. She's a nut. I came across her poetry when I couldn't yet read. Obviously, I went to Choose Pato University because I could only read children's books in Galician, and then I saw a book of hers, and I knew I had to translate it, and so I found her and talked to her, sort of like Danielle, and she said, oh, you can translate it. And then for years I didn't translate it because I wasn't capable, I was so slow. And she would say, now I know what translator, means. Lie. She said to me once, I'm like, why? Because we don't translate accurately? And she's like, no, because you don't translate at all. I'm like, it's coming. But anyways, I translated her because I wanted to be able to read her, and I thought too, in translating her and reading her, that it was somebody who could bring something into English language poetry, because you want something, as Daniel was saying, to exist in your culture. You bring it into the culture. It's not just like, oh, this is a translation, let's put it under glass. It's done. It's finished. Let's put it under some glass. Anyways, I had translated 3 of Choose's books. They were published in the UK. And but impossible, I thought, when I translated this book, her book Secession, which doesn't refer to the American Civil War, but to the beginnings of modernism in Europe, the Viennese secession. Yeah. And the beginning of German Romanticism, too, which is not like English Romanticism. Like Choose will say, I am a romantic poet. We would say she's a postmodern poet. But there is no, in other parts of European poetic history, there is, like the line of modernism, there's only one line. There's no this counter story of postmodernism that this word acquired in North America does not exist in Europe. It doesn't even exist in Quebec because la modernité was modernism. Yeah, postmodernism and.
It was actually like the Lyotard thing was a made-for-order work for the Parti québécois in 78 and published by the Regroupement des Universités.
Anyways, so this book she was asked to write, for this book, Secession, she was asked to write an autobiography. And what she wrote was a kind of, it has autobiographical elements, these texts, and but it also has, it's a poetics, really, talking about the role of the poet, the poem, and things like that. Anyways, I translated it actually for the Rotterdam Poetry Festival and published it myself with Zatso Productions, my little thing that I do through Lulu.com, so that she would have books to sell. But then Jay said, a book thug who doesn't always speak, but he spoke to me, he was going to do, he says, if you take that thing off Lulu, maybe I can publish it. But I was like, you can't because you won't get any money for it. And so it would mean he would have to pay for it all himself, plus do an extra book. Because if you do a book, if you have funding to produce 10 books from the Canada Council, and you think, well, I'll produce 9 plus this one, then next year they only give you funding for 9. So it's like catch-22. They get you both ways, you know. You run into the waiter and then the door hits you, and the tray spills all over you. It's like one of those things where the waiters go in and out of the kitchen and the trays all crash. So, but then I thought, well, I was reading, like, to be a Canadian book, since it has to contain more than 50% work by a Canadian, even though I translated everything, so I wrote all of her words too. Like, there's not a single word in here that I didn't write. But so I wrote my own kind of, I thought I wanted the same age as Truspado. I will write biopoetics and an autobiography poetics, more about translation, but also about poetry. So I called mine In Secession, because mine is in secession. And I put this, secession has an E in red because there's my E, Erin. And then In Secession has a C in black because juice is in it. Often I address juice in the book. So I translated basically for every one of her texts, I wrote a text, one word less than her text. Then at the end, all the words that were left over, I wrote an extra page. I just looked around on my desk and I wrote a text. I'll read it for you. It's very short. It's called 48 or 49. That's 3 words used up there. I still owe 48. It's 47 plus 1, so the book will be Canadian plus 1, missing from Light's End, because I blew my count in another poem. Secession, In Secession, I cannot face for speech prompts her namitude, wherein a present naturalizes the case for translation. Jan is Nayu. It's in Ukrainian. Act 3, I dare not look back. Phone dad, plus 2. So that's 2 more A's missing. So there's one more Canadian page than there is evil translated foreign person page. And so it's a Canadian book, and so Jay could publish it.
But these things might sound silly, but it's in a way it's not. It's the very thing that makes these actions possible. And if you just let it go, you know, well, nothing changes. Yeah. And then if you want these things to exist, you have to deal somehow with the conditions of production, just like they used to say with the old Marxist analysis. And in a way, you know, I think it's something that also has a, let's go all theory here, like as a minor culture, we have to somehow like embrace these means of production and make them do what we want them to do. And it's for the writers to define their own theory of their own literature, in a sense. And I think that can go through very concrete publishing actions and creating the possibility for these things. You know, it's not a permission in a way. It's not a. It's a decision to make these things exist, even though they might not seem needed by some people. Especially with poetry, right? It's almost, I always have a laugh with Paul Bélanger from the Norrois at the beginning of the project, like when we talk about the sales figures and just the necessity of doing these projects, because we want these authors to exist in novel ways, in a sense.
I don't know too. It's participates in other cultures. We bring ideas, we share ideas, we go. It's much more rich than just everybody trying to figure out what's important in the United States and that we should do that, because even the United States is richer than that. But it's kind of I don't know. I feel very privileged and very lucky to have been in this life full of words and engaged with so many people in so many places. I can't think of any life better than this one. It's cool. Yeah.
Sounds like Auguste.